Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. This is a big milestone in my degree, and I just appreciate you being here to support me and to support Dave through this process for the final portion of what we've learned. My presentation today is titled In Response to Civil Unrest, Analysis of Compositional Techniques as Used by Contemporary Composers for Flute. Notable events of civil unrest have provided inspiration for musical works throughout history, including works for flute. Here, 6 works by 5 composers have been chosen for study to explore how these composers utilize the flute to express their reactions and responses to works of this nature. I will provide some background information on each piece and then explore the techniques that each composer uses before I perform for you. The first piece that I will discuss with you this afternoon is called 202-456-1111. This composition is by composer Kaminsky. The phone number here is the public access phone number for the White House. In January of 2017, this line no longer accepted messages. This was when President Donald Trump was taking office, transitioning from President Obama. Instead, the White House left a message redirecting people to social media accounts in order to share messages with them, but the messaging functionality on those accounts was not working. At the time, there was no other line of access to the White House for American citizens. As the composer began working on this piece, before she began, she noted that strong divisions emerged between political parties. And even within each party, she noted a lot of division, especially during the presidential race of 2016. In her mind, she was deeply concerned about Donald Trump being able to maintain a pluralistic democratic society in America. When she called the White House to voice her concerns and met that message that said they were not accepting comments at the time, she experienced pretty strong emotional reactions, including anger, fear, concern about freedom of speech and civil rights. She even experienced nostalgia for earlier times and some hope for the future. So a pretty large range of emotions, which she worked to communicate in this composition. Her piece starts with a narrative, her composition process starts with a narrative or philosophical approach. That is always her biggest priority. And then she tries to find musical tools that will accomplish her goal. Conveying her message, her actual story, is secondary though. Instead, she prefers to prioritize the musical content, the quality of the listening experience. In her mind, an audience who knows nothing of the subject of the piece should still find the piece to be engaging, challenging, interesting, and maybe even entertaining. And then her message is secondary to that. In her compositional method for this piece, she uses what she calls a motivic cell. And in this idea, specific pitches correspond with each number of the phone number. Each digit of the phone number. 0 represents a rest, and you can see here that each of the phone number digits is represented, assigned to a specific pitch. You see that play out in the actual writing. In the beginning of the piece, the motivic cell begins here on a D with a rest, followed by another D representing 202. And later on, when there are 4 ones in the phone number, we see 4 C's in a row presented in the flute part. She does also use notation outside of the motivic cell. That is not the only element in her composition. And these other notes are used to express her own compositional style. In this case, that you can see here, she has a chromatic groove that's going on. And this is very much representative of her aesthetic and her approach to music. Again, represented with a lot of pitches that have nothing to do with the motivic cell itself. So you can see that while her idea for the piece is there, her own personality is, and her own aesthetic for interesting music is present as well. She believes that chromaticism creates its own language, which is trying to have an emotional conversation. She also includes in the score for the performer many expressive language cues, and she encourages the performer to make artistic decisions and to get involved in the creative process themselves. A couple of examples of these are with increased energy, forward-looking, or fierce, shrieking with anguish. I think you'll notice when that one's coming up. It's right around this section here. She uses uses high E and F sharp on the flute repeatedly as a metaphor for her persistent attempts to reach the White House. She dialed many times, wasn't able to get through, and the use of these notes over and over sort of represents her repeated attempts. Okay, so now that you know a little bit of what to expect in this piece, I will perform it for you. Okay, so that last piece that I performed for you is pretty unusual when you're familiar with most standard classical repertoire, but it's actually one of the more traditional pieces you'll hear tonight. The next piece is entitled The Power of Names. This piece by James Devor was inspired by the Say Their Names movement. The sister phrases, say his name, say her name, and say their names, along with this one, are used to draw attention to police violence and racism towards blacks in America. These were brought to the forefront of society during the pandemic, and especially after the death of George Floyd. This piece was written in response to race issues that were observed by the composer in that summer. He did personally witness many instances of racism and injustice with his friends throughout his life, though he may not have been subject to those issues personally. In this piece, he wanted to highlight the power of speaking names out loud. He feels that names are powerful and meaningful and can make an issue more personal. Devor was asked to compose for a very well-known flutist and composer, Natalie Joachim, as a part of a clinic at his university. So he composed this piece for solo flute. When he presented it, he chose not to use program notes, instead listed only the speech elements of his composition. So here's the text you will hear in the piece. Names reveal the true nature and power of a being. Devor worked to strike a balance between modern and traditional approaches in his composition. He used a simple folk-like melody, which was in a pentatonic tonality. This scale is pretty familiar to cultures all around the world. He used had a pretty strong tonal center in his work, and he used a lot of familiar rhythmic elements. To contrast that, he mixed in quite a lot of avant-garde extended techniques. If you are unfamiliar with extended techniques, they are more non-traditional uses of the instrument. Key clicks. You heard flutter tonguing in the last piece just a little bit. That is not technically an extended technique, it's a little more common, but sounds along those lines that are not more normal to the flute. So in using this approach, he worked to help connect with an audience that was newer to modern contemporary classical music, while still maintaining his own modern aesthetic, hoping to balance the two worlds. He wanted people to feel in this piece as if they were surrounded by emotion. Each section of the piece is meant to provide a different emotional experience. He used, like I mentioned, a wide variety of extended techniques. I'm going to demonstrate a few of those for you now. So the beginning, in this larger image here, you see the simple folk-like melody I mentioned earlier, mixed with singing. So you'll hear singing and playing simultaneously. I will wait till the piece to let you hear that one. It'll be pretty obvious. And then speak flute is very much the same. It's pretty straightforward. But I'll demonstrate a few of these others. First, the multiphonics. Multiphonics is when you try to get multiple pitches out of the same fingering, so sounding simultaneously. I'll demonstrate a couple for you here. So one sound may be more prominent than another, but you can still hear more than one sound at the same time. Another one is Big's Big Leando. That's the one on the right, on the bottom. Now this is switching between different fingerings, but still getting the same pitch. And you'll hear that featured in the piece. And then the last one I want to show you is called whistle tones, and it's really just meant to sound like whistling, but using the flute. So those are some of the extended techniques you will hear in this piece. Now his writing typically tries to avoid, at least in this piece, the stereotypical sound of the flute. That sweet, smooth and connected melodic sound that the flute is known for. And instead he experiments with timbral variety, which is what you heard in those extended techniques, making the flute have just a different character of sound. He experiments a lot with that. Instead of leaning on the cliche sounds of the flute, he uses those as a contrast to these other unusual timbres. His piece is full of a lot of academic compositional techniques that would not be obvious to most listeners, even on a 5th or 25th read, as I experienced. One of those is a 12-tone row. which you'll hear in the speak flute section. A 12-tone row uses each pitch of our chromatic scale one time in a specific order. And then he later revisits this 12-tone row, but backwards towards the end of the piece. So again, that's just there for more academic purposes that make him feel satisfied as a composer, of course. The final thing I wanted to share with you about this piece is that he leaves it feeling unresolved by moving the final note up a half a step from what you would expect based on the tonality he has established this far. All right, so here we go with the power of names. As I mentioned, there's some pretty unusual stuff going on in that piece, but it's pretty fascinating. The next piece I'll perform for you is titled Elegy, and this one is much, much different than the prior one, probably maybe the most familiar one to you as far as the way it sounds. This composition by Kristen is an expression of grief, sadness, and emptiness experienced by the composer during the COVID-19 pandemic. She was a single mother during quarantine, and she felt very overwhelmed by the multitude of major social problems experienced early that year. Just to remind you all, because most of us tend to put this stuff out of our mind as we try to process and cope and get back to a normal life. So I'm going to remind you of a few of the things that happened that year, especially early on, that were causing turmoil for her and for most of the nation. First of all, severe wildfires due to climate change. If you remember that year, they were particularly bad. President Trump took office that year, and no matter what side you were on, that was a controversial and traumatic time for most of the nation. The COVID-19 pandemic happened, George Floyd's death happened, Brexit happened, the US also left the Paris Climate Accords, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested related to the Jeffrey Epstein concerns. There was a major Bitcoin scandal that affected some very prominent figures. Many women's rights concerns were important topics during the time. And there was also the beginning of several anti-trans bills in the United States. And for her, those were significant issues. She turned to composition to express her grief and sadness during this time. She felt unable to protect her family and very isolated during quarantine, and she didn't want to add to their stress. So she felt like that was really the only outlet open to her. And of course, it was a natural outlet since she was already a composer. In her approach, she used alto flute for its specific timbre. She thought the sound of the alto flute was perfect for expressing emptiness and loss. She composed in a minor tonality and used some chromaticism to reflect tragedy. In her work, the melody always descends, so moves downwards, and that is a metaphor for sadness or weeping. She also explores the concept of ululation in her piece. If you've never heard that term before, it is a form of expressing strong emotions that's often used in other countries around the world, but not very common to American culture. Some countries that are known for this are Arab nations, Africa, and many other indigenous peoples around the world. Her work does include some extended techniques, not a significant amount, but a few. Mostly they are timbral trills, which are meant to represent crying and sadness, and to serve as a form of ululation in this piece. She also uses pitch bends, and again, they're always downwards to represent crying. And you can see her notation here. This is how she notates timbral trills, and then this is one of her pitch bends. Finally, she uses a technique called tongue rolls, and this one is meant to really significantly emulate ululation. And in that technique, this tongue roll here and here, the performer is supposed to mouth the phrase A with the tongue and use that motion when they're playing. And that's pretty similar to what ululation sounds like in other tongues or in other countries, just not on the flute. So she uses these tongue rolls to acknowledge that all people mourn differently. And for her, it was an important point to note that COVID-19 affected the entire world, not just America. And she wanted to highlight that the struggle was shared worldwide by representing that with these different forms of mourning. pieces are by the same composer, Keyna Wilkins. They have a very different story. They do share some commonalities in the way they're composed, which you'll see. The first piece, Greta, is based on Greta Thunberg's speech at the United Nations Climate Action Summit in September of 2019. At the time of the summit, accepted science was that the planet can only allow for a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature before conditions became life-threatening for the planet. The goal of this summit was to provide solutions to reach a net zero emissions state by 2050. I wanted to share a quote with you. This is the ending of her speech. She says, "Change is coming whether you like it or not." When this speech was given, it had a huge impact on social media. She was 15 years old at the time, and this speech gained much attention for the issue in the days surrounding the summit. In Wilkins' approach, she chose this topic because she cared deeply about the message. She notes that as she gets older, she really wants each of her compositions to be very meaningful. She was drawn to Greta's natural rhythmic speech pattern, which is one of the reasons she chose this piece once she decided on the topic. As she wrote this piece, I wrote mostly improvised. As she prepared this piece, she chose, her primary goal was to enhance the spoken elements and emphasize key parts of the text. In her mind, music creates a mood and an atmosphere that can speak to the emotions. She wants climate change to become a more widely acknowledged issue and wants to reach a new audience about the issue, and she felt that music was a great way to do that. In her writing style, she aimed to match the intensity and drama of Greta's words, but without interfering with her message. In the introduction, Greta establishes a baseline mood with a declaration. The flute mirrors this with a tribal rhythmic motive meant to serve as a war cry. So you'll hear this in the opening section. As the text gains drama later on and intensity, the flute melody responds to that as well. So here, when the words become more intense, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing, you'll notice the flute becoming a little more dramatic with a lot more movement in the part. Later in the speech, the flute becomes more reflective and somber rather than angry, as Greta works through important factors and details surrounding the issue. So the flute again is matching her pace of speech a little bit. There are two loops that are used, the looping pedal, and they're intended to create a choral feel that provides sort of a religious ambience throughout the piece. She feels like the flute, with no accompaniment, can often be very dry, and so she uses the looping pedal to prevent this. And it does add harmonies and gives a fuller, richer sound. She's an experienced improviser, and so she improvised much of this melodic content based on her personal responses to the text. She actually notated this piece specifically for me when I reached out to her asking about it. So she used a few focus notes. As an improviser, an experienced improviser, she chose a few notes that she felt really suited the mood of the piece and chose to use those to base her improvisations on. It's not really tonal, but it does feel sort of modal. She does have some direction in her choices rather than completely freely improvised. She uses a lot of semitones, which she feels like creates a dark and serious atmosphere, and these happen mostly in the dramatic sections. Finally, Wilkins has requested that video accompany this piece so that it has a greater impact during performance.
My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams, my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe. The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice. They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist. So a 50% risk is simply not acceptable to us, we who have to live with the consequences. To have a 67% chance of staying below a 1.5 degrees of global temperature rise, the best odds given by the IPCC, the world had 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit back on January 1st, 2018. Today that figure is already down to less than 350 gigatons. How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions? With today's emissions levels, that remaining CO2 budget will be entirely gone within less than 8.5 years. There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures here today, because these numbers are too uncomfortable and you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us, but the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you. We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now, is where we draw the line. The world is waking up, and change is coming whether you like it or not. Thank you.
The issue itself of climate change can be pretty terrifying, but the piece itself is quite interesting, so I hope you enjoyed the parts of that. Spicy Story is also by Keyna Wilkins, but this piece is about an immigrant named Halal Uddin who fell victim to immigration policy changes in Australia in 2013. He fled Bangladesh after some political activism. He was active against the Popular Party and feared for his life, so he fled. He sought asylum in Australia. He spent over 7 years in detention centers and prisons as a refugee since then. Right now, he is separated from his wife and son and has been for over 5 years. In 2013, Australia's policy on immigration changed. They began denying refugee status to anyone who arrived by boat. Wilkins, being from Australia, feels that this is a racist policy targeting people from the Middle East and Southeast Asia, those who are traditionally Muslim or non-white. Those arriving from Europe, in contrast, usually arrive by plane, and those people were usually granted entrance and were given visas. Wilkins feels this policy changed over time in response to the changing racial tensions since 9/11. There's no proof of that yet, but that is her perspective on it. This policy change was marketed as combating maritime people smuggling. In 2015, politicians in Australia there were allegations raised against them that they paid off boats from Indonesia as much as $40,000 in cash each, asking them to return to Indonesia with their refugees rather than come all the way to Australia. These are not smugglers, these are official refugees. Udin, also known as Spicy, got his nickname because he was a chef in Bangladesh and he cooked for the fellow detainees while he was in Manus Island and Bomana prison. So Spicy was in and out of Manus Island Detention Center and Bomana prison between 2013 and 2022. At one point he was free for a few months and under an active refugee status. He met his wife Alice then and had a child named Mohammed. And this was on Papua New Guinea, where Manus Island Detention Center was. In 2019, he filed a human rights case to avoid deportation. He had already been deported once, and if he won that case, he would be allowed to stay in the country. This case took quite some time, but in 2022, he was finally released, not only a few months ago. The case was ruled in his favor, but he was not granted refugee status as he was supposed to be. During his time in Bomana prison, Spicy converted from Muslim to Christianity. Because of this, he cannot return to Bangladesh. His family and government would seek to find him and kill him. These are words he spoke to me himself when I talked to him over social media a few weeks ago. So he is in fear for his life. Right now, he is in hiding in a third-party country. He is working with the Refugee Advocacy Agency to find a place where he and his family can immigrate to and be reunited. I happened to speak to him on the day of his son's 6th birthday. He was able to call his son since he's free from prison, but he has not seen him in 2 years. When Wilkins began working on this piece, her approach to composing, she wanted to draw attention to the gross injustices against refugees in Australia and in PNG, and to raise awareness for the 2013 policy change. If you were unaware, the prison has extremely unsanitary conditions and is known for egregious human rights violations and severe living conditions. Spicy calls it a torturing center. An example of this, when he was in Bomana prison, there were 50 men to a cell. Most of them slept on the floor and did not have a bed to themselves. There was very little medical care, and what care they did have was very poor. There were no sanitary resources. During COVID, BuzzFeed actually visited the prison and wrote an article on it. After that, each cell was granted one small bottle of hand sanitizer to share. At the time, one of his cellmates had tuberculosis and was not getting medical care. If you're not familiar, that is a life-threatening illness. Another example of how bad the state is with these prisons is that Australia has coined a term called resignation syndrome. This refers to children who are in these detention centers and have given up on life. They don't play, they have no interest in play, they won't eat, they refuse to engage in life in any way. Many of them die from this. Some are put on an IV drip for nourishment, but many die because they have no will to live anymore. Yes, kids are in these camps, and that is happening to children. Wilkins felt like it might actually work to address these topics as an art form, so she has sought out people to write about their stories. She was introduced to Halal Udin and was told he was an excellent singer. To begin this piece, this project, he was recorded from prison singing on a cell phone. And that recording is the foundation for this piece. So as I mentioned, she began with his recording in her composition process. His pitch is about 70 cents flat, so I'll need to retune the flute. He didn't exactly have a pitch reference in Bomana prison, so just went as best as they could. The flute, like I said, must be adjusted. Wilkins uses a call and response style with his lyrics. So this is a style, if you're unfamiliar, that's common to jazz and originates in Africa. It's often used along with storytelling in music, like you hear in blues pretty typically. So you hear some speech and there's a response with the music. And you can see how that plays out in this piece. He speaks, and then when he's got a held note, the flute responds. And then you'll see that the flute holds more of a drone pitch when he's got active lyrics. She responds to Spicy's foot stomps in the recording for a sort of pulse. They're not consistent, but they provide a great beat. Just like in her other piece, many of her melodic figures were improvised. She goes for a very free nature, wanting to respond naturally to the voice. And in her opinion, notation is just a guide, and I have found that to be true in performing this. She did notate it for me, but there's so much where you just have to learn what he's singing and learn how to feel your performance in response to that. She does request the use of a video to help humanize Spicy and to generate empathy for his situation. I would like to note before I perform that Spicy is releasing a cookbook very soon called Recipes from Bomana Prison. You can reach out to me or look that up in the next few months. It should be available.
Australia policy change, premi manusia yang tercari cedera. Process interview refugee stay, decision make me refugee stay. Australia border post deport me, my family suppression hard break. I think my family return back, PNG immigration arrest me, bring me Bomana always present. Still my court process currently struggling my life, 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 my life.
final piece I will be presenting to you today is titled Thoughts and Prayers. It is by Leanna. This piece is based on an interview with Carrie S., who is a survivor of the West Roads Mall shooting in Omaha, Nebraska. Carrie's husband was shot but survived. Her interview with the composer reflects on the process of recovery after an experience like this, both emotionally and physically. She explores both. The composer actually experienced a shooting herself while working on this piece. She was in Seattle during the summer of 2020 at a protest where a gunman drove into the crowd and started shooting. She was within arm's reach of the car, and luckily only one person was injured, and it wasn't her, but she did suffer some effects of that. It has affected her outlook on the public and the way she responds to things in life. Between the date of the commission for this piece in 2019, which was in 2019, and the release date in 2022, 1,557 mass shootings have occurred in the United States. That's in about 3 years' time. She was asked originally to write this piece about social justice issues. At the time, the Parkland, Florida shooting had just happened, and survivors were speaking out. Keith remembers that the students were discussing their reactions, and she really connected with that, and it inspired the idea for this piece. Both she and the commissioner for the piece lived in Omaha, Nebraska during the West Road Mall shooting, so she reached out to someone she knew who had been involved in that event and who was an outspoken survivor and willing to be interviewed. In Keith's view, public mental health and public safety are deeply connected, and she wants to draw attention to this. She is a mixed-race American, half Chinese, half white, and has seen many instances of violence towards minorities, especially during COVID. In her mind, it's clear that acts of violence and mental health are linked. She does note, though, that when it comes to gun violence and mass shootings, these types of violence affect people of all backgrounds and ethnicities. She notes that everyone is in close proximity to a shooting, more so than they probably realize. When I talked to her in her interview, she explained that it's similar to the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon analogy. She says it's more like 3 degrees, though, when it comes to mass shooting, so we're all pretty closely linked at some point. To further illustrate her point, she did experience a live shooting during the process of composing this piece. That's such a stroke of irony. She did want to evoke an emotional response in her composition. She feels our society is somewhat deadened to this topic, and it's true. It's difficult to allow ourselves to dwell on these events regularly. They're pretty overwhelming and devastating. And in response, we've just become numb to those sort of things to some degree. Her goal is to help people re-engage with empathy. She had to work to pair her vision with the commissioning performer's vision. Dr. Christine Erlander-Beard was the commissioner, a fellow flutist. So while Keith did not want people to feel attacked when listening to this piece, she really did not want to traumatize or re-traumatize them. That was a little bit in conflict with Dr. Beard's perspective, but she worked to balance those things. Instead, Keith wants to focus on the recovery process, which comes after an event like this. In her mind, it's the echoes of those experiences that she wants to explore. Dr. Beard wanted people to feel the experience to some degree, and she achieved this by incorporating her own elements during performance. We will discuss garbage noise in a moment, and this is where she really shines in her interpretation and putting her perspective on this piece. Keith does not think in harmonic structures like a traditional composer. Instead, her composition began with Carrie S.'s narrative, and she had to rework that and put it in an order and a timeline since her interview was pretty mixed up. And then she drew on the use of the voice to parallel Carrie's experience. She felt like people really needed to hear Carrie's voice. And then she added her own improvised vocal elements. She really liked the raw grit in the sound that the human voice provided. For her, there was no harmonic intent with chords. However, something akin to chords did result in her efforts. These harmonic creations were purely improvised, though, and coincidental. And you can see down here, these are the vocal parts and the chords that were created based on her improvisations. The flute part was added after the vocals. The intent for the flute part was that it would be a little more independent and have some autonomy. But eventually the performer does join their own voice, my own voice, with the performer to sort of share in this experience. The performer, you can see the notation for the singing by these box note heads. That's how she depicts it in her score. So Keyna is pretty comfortable with extended techniques, but she's very mindful of how she uses them. She only wants to incorporate them for a very specific purpose. And here are a few that she does use. Singing and playing, which you saw on the previous page. She uses pitch bends, shown up here. She uses air sounds. I'll actually demonstrate that one for you. Here are what the air sounds are like. That's the one on the bottom. It's very effective in the piece. She also uses a lot of unusual articulations, which are meant to simulate feet running away or gunshots in the distance. She uses timbral trills, which you've heard in several pieces so far, overtones, multiphonics, whistle tones, and another important one she uses are grace notes. Now that's not an extended technique, but it's characteristic of her writing. Because she's Chinese, she uses grace notes in everything to reflect back to the Chinese flute tradition. Here's the garbage noise I mentioned before. She admits borrowing this from another composer. She's very proud of this technique and thinks it's fantastic, but attributes it to another composer. She feels like this is a very clear notation method. I think you guys, after looking at it, probably will know exactly what it sounds like. I won't demonstrate. I'll let you figure this one out. As she was working, she also wanted to communicate very clearly with the performer, and she worked hard for that goal. She provides a lot of guidance and cues in the score, but she believes the backing track also provides quite a lot of information for the performer, including pacing for the piece, the timbre you should be performing with, the energy and momentum of the piece. Before I perform this, I just want to note, at the time I completed my thesis, which was at the end of March, just a month and a half ago, oh my gosh, 3 weeks ago, 115 mass shootings had occurred since the beginning of 2023, in just 3 months' time. And I think I wanted to share that because it parallels with what she's trying to portray in this piece. I chose this piece last to close my program because I feel she does a particularly good job of communicating effectively through her composition and evoking the desired response out of the audience. So I hope you have a meaningful experience with it in some way as you listen.
At the end of yoga, there is a position called Shavasana, where you lay on your back and meditate. I'm unable to do this position. When I'm laying on my back, all I can hear is sounds. You can hear the gunfire. You can hear the alarm system. They had going on over a loop that the security area had been breached and that the police had been called. You could hear rustles of sound among people hiding. Eventually you heard footsteps, which you could not identify if it was the shooter or if it was the police. There were so many sounds. I heard a sound and knew exactly what it was. I looked over in that direction and saw debris flying in the air. My first thought was for my husband's safety as he was out farther into the store. I started screaming for him to get down, but he started running towards me. I was paralyzed. My initial thought was terror for my husband. I yelled at him to get down, which was, in retrospect, would have been a horrible decision. And they later traced the path the shooter took. If he would have gotten on the ground, he would have been directly in the shooter's path. Running was also a dangerous decision, because that is where he took the bullet to his arm and to his finger. When he rounded the corner to the women's bathroom, and I remained hidden under the toddler's dresses, my thoughts turned to the sounds. You could hear the bullets continue to be fired, and you could hear the alarm system going off. At that point, all my thoughts were focused on surviving for my daughter. The initial recovery was surreal. There was so much media attention, and everyone was asking us how we were recovering. Mostly they were asking my husband, because his wounds were physical. They were easier for people to understand. They kept asking us how we were recovering. What they didn't understand is my mind hadn't even grasped the fact that the shooting had even happened.
After the shooting happened, I was unable to go into any stores. I tried a couple times, but I usually ended up in a corner crying and had to be escorted out by a friend or a family member. Eventually, I was able to return to stores, but I was always looking for exits and escape routes. To this day, when I go into a room, I like to sit closest to an exit. What I really want people to understand about gun violence is how all-encompassing it is. It affects every part of my life. It impacted my parenting, my marriage, my ability to work, my ability to take pleasure out of life. It took me a good decade to get a good foot into recovery, and it's not something that just happens and move on. It kills people and it shatters lives. So for people to give up thoughts and prayers as a solution just brings me to anger. Those aren't solutions. Those are kindnesses. Those are appreciated. Those are not solutions. We need solutions because people deserve better. Society deserves better. Our children deserve better. Everyone deserves better.
I do realize that's a pretty heavy piece, so I didn't want to just leave my program after that. I have some conclusions and findings that I'd like to share with you. First of all, background. The only commonality between all of these composers is political activism. They all have a lot of different traits in their performances and in their experiences, but political activism is the only thing that they share. Most of them use extended techniques, not all of them. There's a pretty wide variety of extended techniques used here that are meant to just portray different feelings, and I think that's really appropriate. There's a pretty even mix of the use of fixed media and the variety of instrumentation. Alto flute is chosen for 2 pieces. Fixed media exists for 3 of them, and a couple of them are unaccompanied, and that's a pretty even mix. One interesting finding I had was with improvisation. Not every composer, but most of these composers, when they were working to figure out how to portray their emotions specifically, they relied on improvisation. Almost all of them who had a priority of expressing emotion in their piece incorporated improvisation at some point in their compositional process, and I think that's pretty noteworthy. About half of these pieces were composed for a purpose in mind. 2 were commissioned, 2 were performed as a request but not exactly commissioned, and 2 were composed just based on the composer's personal interests. So I just wanted to share some of those conclusions with you. Please enjoy a 10-minute intermission. Thank you so much for joining me for this journey. I'm really grateful. We're going to transition over the next 10 minutes to Dave's part of the performance, and I promise his will be much more lighthearted. We will join you after his performance for a reception outside in the common area. Thank you so much.